Shalom and welcome to the Middle East Report. In this program today, we will be discussing the fact that Israel has a new government and a new prime minister for the first time in 12 years. And we'll also be discussing the importance of Israel bonds. Well, welcome to the programme. I have two very special guests with me all the way from North London. One of them is Arnon Perlman, who is the Executive Director of International Sales and Operations for Israel Bonds, as well as Joe Ozer, UK Executive Director of Israel Bonds. So, gentlemen, welcome back to the Middle East Report. And I'll start off with you, Arnon, because you're a fascinating individual, and I can do like 2 or 3 hours talking to you about your knowledge of Israeli politics, Israel, and of course you're representing Israel Bonds here today. But you were an advisor to Ariel Sharon, and so you have this kind of inside view of the Israeli government and how the Israeli Prime Minister's office functions. You've had your own TV program in Israel. So very much want to know, what was your experience like working for Ariel Sharon, one of Israel's great prime ministers?
Thank you very much for hosting us again. It was, as you say, a challenging year, and it's good to be back in person. I was part of Ariel Sharon administration, let's call it. I was appointed as head of media division and advocacy division of the Prime Minister's office, and I was his personal media advisor. So I was in the aquarium, so to speak. That's how it's called in the Israeli slang. The aquarium is the place where the decisions are being made, where Sharon sat, Olmert sat, Netanyahu sat for 12 years, and now we have a new prime minister called Naftali Bennett, who sits in the aquarium. And the place where decisions are being made in Israel is there.
Excellent. And Joe, welcome back to the programme. You did a great job last time on the programme. As we talk about Israel Bonds, this is a very important year for your organisation, primarily because it's your 70th anniversary. And Israel Bonds has played a major role in helping to finance the modern state of Israel over the past 70 years. It's quite an achievement, isn't it?
Yes, it's a huge achievement. Israel Bonds has been, as you said, going for the last 70 years, and we've managed to bring investment from retail clients and some institution, also all the way from the 50s all the way to now, bringing in over $1 billion a year into the Israeli economy.
Incredible. And Arnon, can you just explain to us what Israel Bonds are, and also how you as an organisation has actually coped with this very difficult year and a half that has been marked by COVID-19, the global pandemic?
As Joe was saying, Israel Bond was established. Was established by David Ben-Gurion in 1951 as a way to bring investments into the state of Israel. Ben-Gurion understood in 1950s that a state cannot rely on donations. Ever since, as Joe was saying, we've raised more than $45 billion into the Israeli budget. Israel Bonds money, Israel Bonds investors were involved in every major infrastructure project in Israel from the 1950s all the way to today. And what happened in the last year and a half during COVID-19 pandemic is that we were talented enough, fortunate enough, skilled enough to shift everything into the virtual world. Everything meaning our content, the way we interact with people, the way people interact with Israel content and unique content that we bring from Israel to our supporters and our investors. And we've been able to raise even more money than every year and from more people than every year. And we see the engagement between our clients and in general, the population and the state of Israel became even stronger during the pandemic time, and we are very proud of that.
Excellent. And Joe, I mean, I get asked quite frequently, actually, how our viewers can invest in Israel. So, by investing in Israel bonds, this is a way of helping Israel economically, isn't it, with a good investment in return?
100%. This is a way for people to invest from as little as £100. In a couple of months, we should have some even cheaper investments, which will start at £36. Keep an eye out on our website, www.israelbondsintl.com, for more information as the internet purchasing rolls out to make it even easier. But this money goes directly into the budget of the State of Israel, into a general pot, and it formulates a cornerstone of the economy, because as soon as the government are able to put money into whatever they need to put money into from Israel bonds, it helps with everything that they need to do.
Excellent. And how is Israel bonds doing internationally, particularly in light of the COVID-19 pandemic?
As I said, we had a very good year, all the way from Brazil and Mexico and North America and Europe. And we see that people are both interested in investing in Israel bonds, because we offer them a way to invest, as Joe said, from as little as 100, in some places $36 or pounds, all the way to however they want, and receive the returns the State of Israel is giving, with the backing of the State of Israel. So it's, I would say, we call it a double mitzvah. It's good for everybody. It's good for your portfolio. It's good for the State of Israel. If you want, you can donate the bond to whatever charity organization that you want. So you can make, I would say, a holistic solution for yourself, for the State of Israel, for a charity organization. Everybody enjoys.
Excellent. And what's the rate of return on some of these bonds? Obviously depends on how much you invest, right?
So at the moment, we have a 2-year sterling Jubilee bond, which is paying 1.46%.
One thing we have to discuss really is that there's been a political sea change that occurred on the 14th of June, where we actually saw that there was a vote in the Israeli Knesset for a new election, and 60 to 40,
the vote was
59.
not for new election. The vote was a new government.
Sorry, that's what I meant.
Voting confident in the new government. That's the term.
And a new prime minister as well in
Yes,
Sonny
as part
Bennett.
of the government, of course.
Absolutely. So can you unpack some of the kind of political challenges over the past couple of years? Because Israel has faced 5 elections in the space of 2 years. We have a new Israeli government formed. And is it fair to say that this government is a government of national unity that's built on its dislike for Benjamin Netanyahu, and that's one of the key factors that is uniting all these different political parties to form this government with Lapid and also with Naftali Bennett?
It is fair to say, because that's the way it was portrayed during the campaign and after the election. So for the last 12 years, we had a prime minister called Benjamin Netanyahu, who was in power even before that in '96, but consecutively in the last 12 years. There was an alignment of power in the last election that, as you said everything but not him. For democratic reasons, on a very narrow majority, this government was sworn in. And I think that for some people, it is a democratic achievement. For others, it might be a democratic nightmare. But it is the democratic procedure of Israel, because Israel is a proportional democracy. We do not have direct elections. We elect parties. Parties have chairmen, and the party that has the highest potential to establish a government gets the mandate from the president. What happened was that Prime Minister Netanyahu got first the mandate from the president to establish a government. He couldn't do that. And then the mandate went to Yair Lapid, which was the second largest party. Yair Lapid, together with Naftali Bennett and the Labour Party and Avigdor Lieberman and Gideon Saar with his new party, create a coalition which was able to recommend Naftali Bennett as their nominee to be first prime minister, together with Yair Lapid, who's the alternate prime minister. By the way, very much like it was between Netanyahu and Benny Gantz. Netanyahu was the prime minister and Benny Gantz was the alternate prime minister. So they just changed the people. It's not Netanyahu who's prime minister now, it's Bennett who's prime minister now, but the structure, so to speak, not the parties, the structure is about the same structure. So they create a coalition, government was sworn with the majority of 1, but it doesn't matter. 1, 10, 20, same majority. Government was sworn, Naftali Bennett became prime minister, and the government went on its way.
Absolutely. And Joe, I have to say for myself and a lot of our viewers that Benjamin Netanyahu was a great friend to the evangelical Christian community, and there are many that are actually missing the fact that he's no longer prime minister because he did so much to reach out to our community in support and cultivated that. Looking back, what do you think his legacy is over the past 12 years? Because whether you like him or not, he's been an incredible visionary.
I think that Netanyahu's legacy is going to be having put Israel front and center on the international stage, especially with things like the economy, things in front of the UN. Israel Bonds has been there with him this whole period, especially in the last 7 or 8 years, where we have gone from raising about $600,000 worth of capital per year to $1.2 billion of capital per year. Israel has had a similar increase in their own economy and in their own GDP, in that they went from oranges to apple.
And on. I have to ask you really, because you work closely with Ariel Sharon. Now, for any Israeli political leader, I think you have to go back to the early pioneer of David Ben-Gurion to have anywhere close to the longevity that Benjamin Netanyahu's had. Can you explain to us why he's been so successful to actually be in power for 12 consecutive years since 2009, up until only recently when we have this new government formed?
I think Prime Minister Netanyahu had, and still have, based on the last election, a very, very strong base of supporters in Israel. A very strong base of supporters. This is one. Without a very strong base of supporters, personal supporters of Prime Minister Netanyahu, you cannot stay for such a long time. The second is, Netanyahu was a very, very good political operator. He knows politics, he breathes politics in a good way. I mean, politics is a profession. So he has the support, he knows politics, he knows how to create coalitions, he knows how to maintain strong coalition that are loyal to him and to the cause. So that's the, I would say, the politics side. And as Joe was saying, Israel economy for a long period of time went from strength to strength. Israel diplomatic, I would say, standing in the world, the agreement with the new Arab nation, etc. Again, Israel's diplomatic stand grew stronger and stronger throughout the years. Israel's security, Israel's people's personal security, they felt more secured. They felt better. They had more money. So there were many, many things that Netanyahu was good at. And as you said, not many people were for 12 years in the Prime Minister's office. So I would say it's a combination of all that, personal, political, and achievements for a long time. That's the reason he was in power for such a long time.
And Joe, the fact that we got Naftali Bennett, and he's a very successful politician, isn't he? Primarily because he was born to American immigrants that moved to Israel, made Aliyah. The fact that he served in one of Israel's elite reconnaissance units in the IDF. He then went to set up his own internet security business. I think sold his portion for 185 billion US dollars in New York, came back to Israel, served in Israel's second Lebanon war in 2006 in a combat unit, and then entered politics. So he's a very successful individual, but he's also the first orthodox prime minister that Israel's had. What significance do you think he has in terms of his religious right credentials as prime minister?
I'm not sure that his religious credentials will affect his efficiency as prime minister. I would say that, if anything, it may enhance them. I think that he will see his premiership very much like he has seen his business mentality. I think that he will bring that forward and push Israel as more as a country to do business with than ever before.
Excellent. And Arnon, what do you make of Naftali Bennett? And with this coalition that he's formed, that probably represents the majority perspective of the Israeli electorate, from the centre-right to the further right to the central ground to the hard left, will Naftali Bennett be able to push his own ideas, or do you think that it's really Lapid that holds all the cards?
I think that I will not speak about neither Naftali Bennett nor Lapid. I will speak about prime ministership.
Yep.
The way I know it from Sharon's time. There's something which is much bigger than an individual when you walk into the office of the prime minister or any ministerial office, but of course the prime minister. Something which is bigger than an individual. Something which is bigger than the ideas of an individual. And it is the state of Israel. For thousands of years, whether we were there or we're not there, it's the state of Israel, the Jewish people. And I think that by working together, by collaborating, cooperating, thinking together, I would say facing challenges together, I think this government can work. And I think with the Prime Minister and with the Minister of Foreign Affairs and with the Minister of Finance and with the Minister of Security, Gantz, which we haven't mentioned it, by working together, by sitting in the cabinet's meeting and understanding that there is a dynamic here, and the dynamic sometimes is larger than the individual, it can and should work. And the loneliness of number one is, you have to understand, the Prime Minister Sharon once said that when I walk into my office, I sit on my chair, I look back, there's just a wall behind me. There's nobody there. The buck stops here. And the combination of everything and the knowledge of people, Naftali Bennett is part of the political system. Yair Lapid is part of the political system. Avigdor Lieberman is even a bigger part of the political system because he's been there for so many years. Gantz knows security and politics. So there's a group of people which are very talented and knowledgeable. And if they harness everything together, as they did to establish the government, it'll be a success.
So let's have a look now at this excellent report put together by CBN, Chris Mitchell, that looks into Israel's formation of a new government and a new prime minister.
Today, the new government posed for the traditional picture with Israeli President Reuven Rivlin. On Sunday night, by the slimmest of margins, 60 to 59, the Knesset approved the new coalition government. During his speech, incoming Prime Minister Naftali Bennett was heckled constantly by members of the opposition. But Bennett, who was once Netanyahu's ally and now rival, recognized his former boss.
Thank you, Benjamin Netanyahu, for many years of service and lots of achievements for Israel. As Prime Minister, you worked for many years with devotion and to our political and defensive power.
Netanyahu now serves as leader of the opposition and cited how his governments have transformed Israel.
Members of Knesset, our achievements from a marginal state to a rising power in the global arena, this is our way. Mine and my friends from the National Bloc, my friends on the real right. And if it is destined for us to be in the opposition, we will do it with our backs straight until we topple this dangerous government and return to lead the country in our way.
Netanyahu questioned if Bennett would be willing to disagree with U.S. President Biden. and vowed he would be back. Bennett now leads a checkerboard coalition of 8 parties representing left, center, right, and for the first time, an Arab Islamist party.
Well, it's true that this government has a very difficult path ahead of it, a narrow parliamentary majority, a very heterogeneous government, and in this respect it will be challenging to keep it together.
Right after the vote, the new government held its first cabinet meeting. It faces daunting challenges at home and threats outside its borders. Still, earlier this year, Bennett told CBN News he was up to the job.
I'm ready to take that responsibility as former defense minister, former entrepreneur and CEO of companies. I think I've got what's necessary to pull Israel out of this hole and sort of go to the next phase of Israel as the startup nation.
While President Joe Biden congratulated Bennett, differences between the two allies on the Iranian nuclear deal may test the new government.
The renewal of the nuclear agreement with Iran is a mistake that will give legitimacy again to one of the darkest and most violent regimes in the world. Israel will not let Iran arm itself with a nuclear weapon. Israel is not part of the deal and will continue to maintain full freedom of action.
After 4 elections and more than 2 years of political paralysis, it remains to be seen if this new government will provide the stability many Israelis are hoping for.
Excellent job there, produced by CBN, looking into the new Israeli government and Prime Minister for the first time in 12 years. Joe, as a British Jew, what is your perspective when we look at Israeli politics? Because it's a completely different Israeli political system. I mean, they have the most purest form, I think, of proportional representation. So many different views are reflected in so many different parties. It's very different to our kind of big party majority first past the post system we have in Parliament. So what's your perspective and what do you make of this new government?
Well, I think that the system in Israel is very similar to the UK, actually, even though it seems like it's a complete maze and very different. When you strip it down, it is very similar. Like, they have the first past the post system like we do, but the only difference is that we have 2, arguably 3 major parties, and they have 15, like 16. Like I think, what was it, 24 was the record this year? Wow. Of huge amounts of support for each party. So it makes it a lot harder, more of a puzzle than our system, but it's still, the bare bones of it is very similar. I mean, it's not surprised because it was based on our system.
I find that really interesting. Arnon, what confuses me, and maybe the best person to answer this one, Naftali Bennett in the previous Israeli elections didn't win a seat. He wasn't even elected to the Knesset. This last election, he wins 6 seats, and now he finds himself in a position of Prime Minister, but also with Yair Lapid as well, choosing to govern for the latter 2 years of this 4-year term of this government. Firstly, how did he become Prime Minister, and why was he chosen to go first?
I think that the last election were defined by, as Joe was saying, there were many parties. There was a Gideon Sa'ar's party who left the Likud, and there was Yair Lapid, and there was Benny Gantz with blue and white, and there was Avigdor Lieberman and the Labour Party and the Arab parties and the Haredik Party, 2 of them. So there were many parties, so there was sort of a split of the votes. This is one thing. The second thing is it's irrelevant how many mandates you have as a result of the election. If you are recommended, and this is the law in Israel, if you're recommended as a prime minister to the president by a majority of parties, then you become the prime minister after the vote in the parliament. So you could have had 4 mandates, theoretically, and if all the 60 behind you recommend you, okay, or the person who got the mandate directly from the president recommends you, and there's a vote of confidence, you become the prime minister and the government is sworn. This is the system, and this is democracy in Israel. And I think that the coalition, as I said in the beginning, that was formed, let's say, just not Netanyahu coalition, as it was called in the Israeli press, was for the first time not just a strong one, but a strong one that can produce somebody that they will all agree that becomes a prime minister. Because what happened in many other elections was that there might have been somebody there, but there wasn't a unanimous agreement between, I would say, all the parties that are supposed to create a coalition. This time it was different. So even people from the left said, okay, we accept Naftali Bennett as a prime minister. Even people from the right said, okay, we accept Yair Lapid as the alternate prime minister. So, as I said before, there was a unique moment in time that everybody put their ego aside, and decided this is what we need to do, we're going forward. This is a very unique moment in politics, by the way, in the world, where politicians put their ego aside and work for what they think is the best cause. And that's what happened. That's how he became prime minister. I'm putting aside the fact that he's talented, bright, a great businessman, a great politician. I'm putting all that aside. That is a given, okay? But if you're asking me the structure that brought him to become a prime minister, that was the structure.
Interesting, thank you. And Joe, some question marks do remain over the legitimacy of this government. The fact that Netanyahu's party Likud won 30 seats and Naftali Bennett's party only won 6. Obviously, it depends on where you come from in the Israeli political spectrum to see whether you like this party or don't, as Anon said earlier. But does this government have legitimacy?
I think every government that is elected fairly by due process has legitimacy. I don't think that's ever going to be in question. As much as you may not like the situation, that is who the people have voted for, and that's who will continue in the next 2 years as prime minister, and then change to Yair Lapid for the next. Is it 2 years after that as well?
I want to emphasize on this point for a second, because there are many people, I would say, who are calling to change the system in Israel this way or that way, which if it'll happen, by all means, no problem. But as Joe was saying, this is the system. This is the proportional democracy system in Israel. Everything is according to the law. There is no question, and there shouldn't be any question, about legitimacy, about the prime minister, about the government. This is the system in Israel. This is democracy. You cannot accept democracy when it is good for you and disregard democracy when the results are not to your taste. This is the democratic process of the state of Israel. And this is how it should be. And this is what happened. And I think that once the dust was settled down, this is a proof of strength of the state of Israel. This is a very good sign for the state of Israel, that government change, prime ministers change. Everything changes as long as it's done according to the law and according to democratic procedure. And once this one is a prime minister, and then the other one is a prime minister, and then the third one is a prime minister. This is democracy. And as an Israeli, I'm so proud of what happened.
So looking at some of the players involved, and you have to ask Yair Lapid from the Yesh Atid party, represents the kind of traditional centre-left in Israeli politics, maybe more a progressive party than the kind of traditional Labour Party that's held power really up until 77 from Israel, from 48 up until 77. So what kind of leader is he, and what does he bring to the table? Because he's Israel's new Minister of Foreign Affairs. So I'm sure that he will bring in new ideas into the Israeli Foreign Ministry. And
These are two different questions, by the way.
What
kind of person is he, and new ideas? Two different questions. Both of them, by the way, are good, but two different questions. Yair Lapid has been in the political system for many years already. You know, we always say he came from the media, but he's been for many, many years already a politician, and a hands-on good politician. A politician which without sounding condescending, has grown amazingly into this position of being a politician. He was Minister of Finance before, but you can see that the process he knows politics. So now he became an alternate prime minister and the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and rightfully so. Now that brings us to your second question, the new ideas that he brings to the government, to the table. I'm sure that he has new ideas, and I'm sure it has to do with the whole spectrum of what is the foreign policy of Israel. But the foreign policy is very intricate. It's not just the Minister of Foreign Affairs. It has to do with economy, as Joe was saying. It has to do with every aspect, because we cannot look at it as if it was 50 years ago. The world is flat today. So foreign policy is everything. Foreign policy is the economical aid we're giving to nations in Africa, and foreign policy is our trade with China, and foreign policy is our political ties with Russia and with America. Everything is foreign policy. And as I said before, it's a group of smart people who are sitting together and thinking, and that's how it should be. You cannot segregate. You cannot say, I have the foreign policy or he has the foreign policy. It's part of a bigger picture. And I think the people who are there, Avigdor Lieberman and Yair Lapid and Benny Gantz and of course Naftali Bennett, the Prime Minister, and Gideon Saar was one of the most talented politicians I've ever met, and I know him because he was the Cabinet Secretary of Prime Minister Sharon. We were together there. So they're all very talented politicians, and in a very good way, young politician, in a good way young. They look and they have many years in the political system, many, many years ahead of them, and many, many years of working together. And that is, again, a good thing for the state of Israel. Because when a prime minister and a politician and a leader looks into the horizon and think several steps ahead and thinks to himself, I will be there when it happens, the process is far better than looking at the tip of your nose. So I think that, again, if everything goes well, because I have to be honest, I've left prophecy lesson 1, so I didn't graduate, so I don't know. But I think if there will not be anything we cannot expect, it looks very optimistic.
And Joe, you were telling me before the program started that all these political leaders that have formed this new government have signed up to a memorandum where they put their egos aside and they want to govern in the best interests of Israel. So considering how small the majority is of this government, can they actually survive?
Yeah, I think it absolutely can survive. There are some self-regulation things in check to put everyone in check. Everyone has an equal footing, irrespective of how many seats they have in the Knesset in terms of decision making. And I think one of the best things about this government is that it showcases to the world that Israel is not just a society of one thought, and it's a society where there is a whole, I mean, for want of a better term, rainbow of thoughts and all sorts of different people being represented within the government, not just within the opposition. So it's a great sounding board for the state of Israel.
If I may add something, we haven't spoken about the fact that, and again, as a proud Israeli, for the first time there is an Arab party as part of the coalition.
I was going to ask you that next.
It's I'm telling you again, it's, as an Israeli, I'm so proud of it, because it's one thing saying the Arab citizens are an integral part of the state of Israel, which they are. They are the same citizens as any other Israeli, but it's the first time they are part of the government. It's not just saying, they are part of the government, and they are part of the establishment of Israel, not just as Knesset parliament member, but as part of the government. And this is very, very important. This is one thing. And the second thing, you were asking, Joe, about majority. I think that for now, once the government was established, we have to take this word of majority and take it out of the equation, because according to the Israeli political system, 2-1 is a majority. It's already a majority. There's almost all the legislation can be passed in a regular majority. So if you're saying, how can this government coexist, I would say, belief-wise, that's one question. And as we were answering, if they all rise above their personal ego and understand the greater cause is more important. But in terms of hands in the parliament majority, 2-1 is enough majority to pass any legislation. And yes, like in Sharon's time when he was governing with 19 mandates in his party, there will be days that will be dedicated to sitting in the parliament and voting in order not to lose any vote. But that's political work. That's going back to grassroots political work. That's how it should be. They should be in the parliament. They should vote. They should be involved. They should not sit up there and just look at things from up. The government should be involved in the parliamentary work as well.
And you mentioned the Islamist, the Arab Party, but isn't there, particularly within conservative sections of the Israeli media, very, very concerned at the fact that this Ra'am party has joined the coalition with links to the Muslim Brotherhood and been labelled effectively the representatives of Hamas in the Israeli Knesset? And isn't there a danger that some of the very sensitive security information that the Israeli government will share and have to deal with could end up in the hands of Hamas or the Palestinian Authority or the Islamic Republic of Iran, Israel's enemies?
My answer would be the same like Sharon would have told me if it was 20 years ago. You shouldn't believe everything you read in the newspapers. I think it's a proof of strength. I think there is no danger in it. I think that they are Knesset member. The Arab parties who were Knesset parliament members almost forever. And I think that if we boast that we are a democracy, and if we're proud of being a vibrant, inclusive democracy, they should be part of the government, and I do not see any problem with it. They're Israeli citizens. They're holding a blue ID card. They're as Israeli citizens as I am, and they should get all the options as I have. And I think that linking them to the Hamas or linking them to any terror organization is just, I would say, you know what? I would use the word propaganda, which I think is wrong. And I think that people who are doing it are just, I would say, deepening the chasms within the Israeli public, and that's a bad thing to do.
That's good to get your perspective on that. And Joe, we know that Israel recently has had an incredibly challenging time. Israel was leading the world in terms of eradicating COVID-19, had the biggest and the quickest mass vaccination program of any country in the world, and the nations were looking to Israel for answers in how to defeat COVID-19 until we saw the flare-up in Jerusalem, and then also that 11-day Hamas offensive in which they fired rockets and missiles into Israel, and then we saw Israeli respond through airstrikes for 11 days, where the whole picture of Israel changed in the media. So for the first time before this conflict, Israel was always seen through the prism of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but for the first time, Israel was being recognized as a nation, as a global problem-solving nation. And then it feels like we've gone 10 steps back with incredibly negative and vile media coverage of Israel during that conflict. How do you think the government, this new government, can respond to the new challenges that are in place? New administration in the States that has empowered and emboldened the Iranian regime as well as the Palestinian Authority and also Hamas. And how do you think this new government will be able to meet the big geostrategic challenges that are happening in the Middle East?
It's not easy. The government will have a huge task on their hands. I think one of the worst libelous things that are bandied around far too easily, in my opinion, is that Israel's an apartheid state. Well, an apartheid state that has included a Arab party in the government is probably one of the worst apartheid states that you could think of. It fails miserably at apartheid. But it's still, at the end of the day, you're not going to change many people's opinion if they just dig their heels in and don't listen. So the biggest challenge that the Israeli government will be is to allow and make people listen to what they have to say and to show them that they're not what they think they are.
If I may, Israel is a very strong country, and strong military-wise, economic-wise. It's a strong country. And the concern that you raise, which are true, the concern that Joe was speaking about, the way Israel is portrayed in the public, the anti-Semitism and anti-Israeli notions that came because of the last operation, that, as a side note, no country in the world would agree that rockets would be fired on its capital, no matter what the reasons are. And there are no reasons, because we left Gaza. And I don't see anybody agrees that rockets would fall on London or Washington or Paris or Brussels or any capital. But putting that aside, we're not really liked after the last operation. But we have to remember, Israel is a strong country, a vibrant, strong country. There is no danger to the existence of the state of Israel. We were excellent and still are when it comes to vaccinations. And after the dust settled down, we were also very, very good at the way the government handled the last operation. We didn't go with ground troops. We tried to do our best not to kill civilians. We were the most humane army that there is in the world. And we've done all that with the understanding that Israel will bear the consequences of not being loved, so to speak, in some echelons, in some media outlets in the world. But it's okay. The reason it's okay, of course, we need to fix it, we need to do advocacy, we need to do everything. But when you drill down, the faith and the security of the people of Israel and of the state of Israel is more important. And Israel is a very strong country. It was, it is, and it will be. And whatever challenge Israel will face, be it security-wise or COVID-wise, we've shown we know how to handle it.
That's very true. Absolutely. And leading on from there, I mean, we have heard intelligence reports have been leaked to the media. We've even heard US Secretary of State Blinken mention the fact that the Iranian regime is very close to a nuclear breakout. And we know that this is a kind of game changer in the Middle East, the world's most dangerous regime having the world's most dangerous weapon. And we've seen leaders like Ahmadinejad, the supreme leader of Iran, Khomeini, actually call for the annihilation of the state of Israel. Now, we saw that in the 1950s with Nasser in Egypt and other nations, but in the modern era, there is no other nation that's calling for the destruction of another nation. And we know that Israel is constantly having to deal with Iranian terror proxies such as Hamas and Hezbollah and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and they're an absolute menace to the region. But there is a different policy that the US administration is taking with Biden, wanting to reinstate the Iran deal, give the Iranian regime billions in sanctions reliefs again, wouldn't actually stop their nuclear weapon development. So how does this new government and Naftali Bennett deal with this major problem in terms of foreign policy, which is a nuclear Iran?
First of all, I cannot comment on what the American wants or do not want and what is their policy. I'm not aware enough. I can tell you that Iran is not an Israeli problem. It is not an Israeli problem. I think that the Gulf, the Emirates, the Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia, the entire Middle East, almost the entire Middle East, is threatened by Iran no less and even more than Israel. And they're concerned by Iran, sorry, not less, but even more than Israel is. Iran is a danger to the world, not to Israel. And I think that is the policy Netanyahu was trying to implement, and I'm sure the government will continue to implement. And Iran is a general problem, destabilizing the whole region, and the whole region being destabilized affects the whole world. And I think that there might be differences in how to deal with the Iranian problem. And I'm sure there are differences in timetable in dealing with the Iranian problem. But I think that one of the things that we can say for sure, the Iranian issue better dealt quietly. The more people speak about it, the more it's in the press, the more people boast about what they've done or what they haven't done, I don't think it's helpful. I think the Iranian issue better be dealt with quietly. I didn't say how, but better dealt quietly. Whatever you do, whatever you want to reach, it can be done quietly. And I think that I trust certainly the leaders of the State of Israel and also others to know what is their way of dealing with it, understanding it is not a specific problem that involves Iran and Israel. It is a much larger issue that has to be dealt in a much larger context.
And Joe, when we look at kind of the geostrategic dynamics that Israel faces, we know that Iran is essentially supporting proxy groups in terrorist groups in Yemen, and there's a huge build-up of Iranian troops and militias in Syria that poses a threat, as well as their sponsorship of Hezbollah, and knowing that Israel did incredible damage back in 2006 to Hezbollah's operations. But that still doesn't take away the fact that there are around 160 to 180,000 rockets facing Israel from Hezbollah. That is the big concern for Israel, isn't it? Rather than the threat posed by Hamas in Gaza.
I would say that Israel's concern is not just 130,000 rockets. It's one rocket. Israel does not want war of any kind, conflict of any kind with its neighbours. It just doesn't want it. It wants to get on with its life, live in peace and harmony with everyone around it. So to compare Hamas to Hezbollah, it's difficult. Is difficult to say because even one rocket is problematic.
I would say we do live in a rough neighborhood. I agree with you. It's a rough neighborhood. It has been rough for many, many years.
Biblical times?
I wouldn't say that many because I wasn't there, but I can tell you that my great-grandfather came to Israel in 1882.
Wow, amazing.
So many generations ago. And situation was rough then. The neighborhood was rough then from different perspectives, and it is rough today. But first of all, to repeat what Joe said, we as the State of Israel would like to live in peace and quiet with everybody around us. And there are nations, when we don't have any territorial/strategic dispute with Jordan, Egypt, we do not have any dispute with them. Whatever we had was solved already. So, and of course, the Emirates, Bahrain, all the new countries, we just had peace agreements with them. We would like to live, and for all the others to live as well, in prosperity and peace and quiet. But the neighborhood is rough. It has always been like that. And our job, the government of Israel, the state of Israel, the army of Israel, is to make sure that as rough as it gets, and sometimes it gets rougher, we're the strongest. And we'll prevail. And it doesn't contradict the fact that we want to live in peace. We want to be able to go from Tel Aviv to Lebanon, to Syria, to Turkey, to all the way to Europe, driving a car. Should be natural. The fact that we want that does not mean that we're not strong enough to make sure that no matter what happens, we're there. And that's the job. The job is to dream, but to make sure that reality is also very much happening and making sure that the near future and the far future and thousands of years into the future, the state of Israel is still there.
And Joe, we're down to less than 5 minutes to the programme, and I suppose all the strategic challenges that Israel faces and the need for a strong defence is really where Israel bonds come in, because this is an investment in Israeli infrastructure as well as their military infrastructure, and it does help, doesn't it, in terms of the Israeli budget, that there are more money at the hands of the Israeli Prime Minister to make military decisions or to invest in business and high tech. So share with us how vital Israel bonds are to the Israeli economy, and particularly to the new Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett.
Whenever I'm asked the question of where the money goes to and what it's used for, I always give an analogy that imagine like the money in your wallet. You've had a £10 note from M&S and in change, and like coins from the corner shop, but in reality, you've got all your money from different places, but it's all in one place, which is your pocket, and you go and you use it to spend on everything you need to for the day. It's a similar situation with Israel bonds. The money has gone into the general pot of the budget of the State of Israel, and then they go and they use it for every little thing that they need to spend money on, be it for roads, for military, for tax breaks, for whatever it is that they have to spend for running a country. That's what it goes to. And in response to the way Naftali Bennett, you ask, he will use it in the same way. We have been around, as you mentioned at the beginning of the programme, for 70 years. This is our 70th anniversary year. We have been with every iteration of government since Ben Gurion, who started this programme. And we will be with every iteration of the government in the future, because we are here to bring funds in for the government, by the diaspora, for people who support the State of Israel, so that they can support in a way that doesn't have to cost them anything. They invest in it and get a return on their investment.
Excellent. And Anon, I'll probably give you the final words. Now, what strikes me is the Genesis chapter 12, where God talks to Abraham that I will bless those who bless you, and I will persecute those who persecute you. So essentially what we're seeing here, there is a kind of spiritual blessing, isn't there, when people decide to invest in Israel, bless Israel, support Israel from the Almighty. What's your perspective on this as well? And this is a good way for viewers to get involved in helping to support the State of Israel, regardless of its government.
First of all, I think that a good way to support the State of Israel is to invest in the State of Israel. Whether there are people who want to buy real estate in the State of Israel or people who want to invest in Israel bonds. It's a good way to invest in Israel. This is one. In regards to the prophet you were saying, yes, God told Abraham that he will smite the enemies of the State of Israel, so to speak. But it is our job, the State of Israel, the government of Israel, the people of Israel, to make sure that happens. So as if I go back to what I said before, it is our job to protect ourselves. Like the Prime Minister Sharon used to say, the only place in the world the Jews can protect themselves by themselves. And the last thing I would tell you is that my wife just came back from Israel, and she went post-COVID, let's call it, or post-Israel COVID, and 2 days post the last operation in Gaza. And she phoned me a day after she landed, and she said, there are people on the street, everybody is alive, everybody's in the cafes and restaurants, everybody's partying, everybody's on the beach. Because the one unique thing about the people of Israel is the desire to live. The desire to live. It doesn't matter if it comes because we were expelled from Israel 2,000 years ago, or because of the Holocaust. It doesn't matter. There's a desire for life. And I think that if we share this desire for life, no matter the hardship, with our neighbors, with the world, this desire to live, no matter what happens to you, I think not just this, but this is a very important thing about Israelis. And I'm sure your viewers, whoever reads about Israel, visited Israel, will visit Israel in the future, will see that the desire to live, to enjoy, to have fun, to wait for the sun to shine tomorrow It's a very unique thing about Israelis.
Absolutely. L'chaim, right?
L'chaim.
So Joe, Anon, thank you so much for being
Thank you very
special
much for
guest
having us
on this program today. Really enjoyed it. And I want to thank you for watching this program today. We certainly unpacked Israeli politics and the nature of this new Israeli government and also Prime Minister. And also we've explored the practical way that you can stand with Israel and support the people of Israel through Israeli bonds. So thank you for watching today's Middle East Report.